Good evening, Scar Island fans. This is your narrator, Mrs. Beth here. Yeah, I'm still here. Last time we met, we read chapters 11 and 12. 11, A Beautiful Rat. Need I say more? If you heard it, you remember it. He's down there and meets the librarian and his pet rat, 99, I think, right? Who looked more like a cat than a rat. And he asks for a candle to help him find his way back upstairs for chapter 12, which is I Know What You Did. You know how that chapter ended with Benny saying, I know what you did. But we know that our favorite character, Jonathan, has got the key with the information about what he did. So he's going to hold on tight to that key, isn't he? So he goes upstairs and tells his friends, he actually doesn't tell them too much, does he? He keeps it kind of close to the vest. That's an expression. He keeps it close to himself. He doesn't really reveal too much about what he knows because he thinks he tells them about what he learned down there and what's going on down in the library. Then they'll bother the nice guy, the nice old guy that's down there with his pet rat. Okay, so he remembers as the last chapter ends. He remembers the librarian's warning echoed in his mind. Things always go bad out there. Out there meaning at Scar Island, in that upstairs area. That's why he doesn't go there anymore. Okay, I kind of create the mood here. Get the candles lit around here to make it look a little bit, whatever. Chapter 13, The Secret. Okay. Colin was right about Sebastian being angry at Jonathan. He showed his anger after dinner in the flickering light of a dozen candles scattered throughout the dining room. Hey, I scattered candles around. Who do? Sebastian swallowed a final bite of a shortbread and wiped the corners of his mouth, then stood up. He banged his metal plate on the table to get everyone's attention. All right, in the morning, we'll have to meet the mail boat again. You ready for that, Gerald? Gerald burped and nodded. Good. You all can drag your mattresses wherever, even in here if you want. The boys looked around. It was a big room with plenty of floor space, but it was also a little close to the freezer. Now, Sebastian continued, it's time to refill the coal furnace. We need 2 people. How about, his voice trailed off as he scanned the room, Colin, and let's see. His dark eyes glittered in the candlelight and flashed to Jonathan. He smiled. Johnny. Oh, wait. You don't like fire, right? Jonathan's eyes dropped to the floor. He rubbed his hands on his sleeves. Well, sorry. Everyone has to take a turn. Be sure to fill it real full. It's a little dark. I'm going to move this light over here for myself. There. Okay. Sebastian grabbed a candle and stalked away from Benny and some others at his heels. They disappeared out the door that led to the grown-ups' bedrooms. I think it's my glasses. I'm not very clean or something. Maybe I need to get a stronger lens. Wow, I can see. Oh my goodness. This quarantine is taking its toll. All right. Colin sighed and looked at Jonathan. Well, he said, I guess we should just go and get it over with. It's not that bad. Jonathan nodded. Yeah, okay, let's do it. The furnace was in a room beneath the kitchen, down a steep, short staircase. The room was hot and muggy and smelled like a wet ashtray. The ceiling was so low, Jonathan could have jumped and touched it. It too was made of stone blocks held together with crumbling mortar and forming a steep arch so that it curved down to meet the floor at both walls. The furnace was as black as an iron monster the size of a car, squatting in the far darkness. It hissed and hummed and rumbled. The rest of the room was filled with waist-high heaps of lumpy black coal. A little trail wound between the coal piles to the furnace. I like this. The furnace was a black iron monster the size of a car squatting in the far darkness. Squatting, this furnace. Is a furnace squat? No, but it's just so you feel that kind of lump in the corner there. Monster lump. Anyway, that's a lot of coal, Jonathan said. Yeah, Jonathan answered, hanging his lantern from a hook on the ceiling. Coal delivery day ith the worst. 3 hours of wheelbarrow work. And for every little lump you drop, you get a minute on the thinner thorough. I dropped 10 last time. Ouch. They walked to where a couple of shovels were leaning against a wheelbarrow. They each grabbed one and started scooping coal into the wheelbarrow. The scraping of their shovels echoed on the low stone ceiling. Black dust from the coal sifted up, and soon they were both coughing and clearing. You coming? Come on. Kitty, come on. Oh, kitty, come on. What's your pain? When you want her to come, she doesn't come. Oh, back up, give her some space. You coming? Kelly, come on. Come to visit. Ah, there she is. There's your kitty. Hello. Want to keep me company while I read? Oh, it's nice. It's nice to have a cat. I'm telling you. I recommend cats. I do. Oh, I know people are dog lovers, but I'm a cat lover. Yes, hello. Nice to see you. She's not going to stay, I can tell. She's too excited for some reason. You know, nocturnal they are. So anyway, am I going to ever finish reading this? You're asking yourself right now. Soon they were both coughing and clearing their throats as they shoveled. What was really there? Colin asked between breaths, at the hatch. Just a door, Jonathan panted back. I told you. Collinton shook his head. You're keeping something. A secret. That's why we called it a secret, huh? Jonathan stopped and leaned on his shovel. How do you know that? Colin shrugged and kept on shoveling. I watch closely and listen. Almost no one else does that. And I can tell you didn't tell everything. Jonathan sighed and scraped another shovelful of coal into the wheelbarrow. You're good, he admitted, then told Colin about the sounds and the skull and the strange ancient-looking door with the spinning handle. He didn't mention, though, the other staircase or the librarian. A skull? That's so weird. It's like a warning or a threat. He dropped his shovel and grabbed the handles of the full wheelbarrow. Maneuvering through the coal piles, he rolled it up to the growling furnace. Jonathan followed cautiously behind him. At the furnace, Colin stepped forward and turned a few rusty bolts, then swung open a thick metal door. A blast of heat rippled out into the room. Jonathan took a steep step back and covered his face with one arm. He squinted out from under his elbow. Just like this. Inside the furnace was a burning hell of flames and fire, glowing in shifting hues of red and orange and blazing white. He couldn't look at it without narrowing his eyes to slits. The heat made the air waver and ripple. Colin turned and saw Jonathan backing away. He blinked and then swung the furnace door mostly closed. You're scared, he said, and Jonathan looked away. Why? Jonathan shook his head. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his face. You can trust me, Colin said. His voice was soft but insistent. Jonathan nodded and swallowed a ball of fear. Something happened, he said, his voice shaky. To me. What? Jonathan took 2 steps forward and undid the buttons of the sleeves of his shirt, one after the other. He pulled his sleeves up his elbows and held out his arms to Colin, showing his arms. Colin's cold-smeared face leaned closer to see. The lantern swung from its hook above them, making shadows writhe and twist around them. His eyebrows rose into beads of sweat on his forehead, his mouth rounded in surprise. He reached out and ran his fingers softly over the twisted grooves etched into Jonathan's skin. He brushed his fingernails gingerly over the toughened swirls of hard scar tissue that covered Jonathan's arms, all the way from his wrists until they disappeared into his bunched-up sleeves. Jonathan's hands were shaking. With a gasp, he pulled back suddenly and tugged his sleeves back down to cover his tortured arms. I don't like to show people, he stammered, desperately fumbling with his sleeve buttons. I don't like to see them myself. He added more quietly. Colin grabbed Jonathan's trembling hands and held them still. And then he gently buttoned up the first of Jonathan's sleeves. Oh, that makes Miss Beth sad. They're burns, he whispered. Were you caught in a fire? No, Jonathan shook his head. Tears sprang to his eyes, and he looked away. I was not in the fire. Colin finished buttoning the second sleeve and looked up at Jonathan with eyes that were quiet and wide. He was watching closely and listening. When? When did this happen? Jonathan took a ragged breath. A while back, he answered. What happened? Jonathan ground his teeth together. He blinked and shook his head. We should finish the coal. Okay, sir. Colin turned and reopened the furnace door. The small, suffocating room once again filled with heat and angry light. Colin pushed the wheelbarrow right up to the furnace's open red mouth. It's okay, he called back over his shoulder. I think I can do it myself. He grabbed both handles of the wheelbarrow and struggled to tilt it up into the furnace. He grunted and his feet slid and slipped on the coal-dusted floor. Jonathan shook his head and winced. He watched Colin wrestling with the heavy wheelbarrow. His arms were crossed, the fingers of his hands rubbing through his sleeves at the burns on his arms. Colin looked so small, so helpless by the burning fire, so in need of help. Jonathan stepped forward, shoulder to shoulder with Colin, and took hold of one of the handles. Together they lifted it and dumped the load of coal into the waiting flames. There was a shower of sparks and a fresh wave of heat. Jonathan's arms burned. They let the wheelbarrow drop, and Colin slammed the furnace door. The boys stood panting, leaning on the wheelbarrow. Their hands were black and sweat dripped muddy trails through the coal on their faces. Well, Jonathan said, pulling at his shirt where it stuck to the sweat on his body. That wasn't so bad. Yeah, Colin responded between coughs. That was one. It takes 5 to fill it. Can you imagine? Walter and Colin pulled their mattresses into a corner of the dining room by the kitchen, away from the windows to the courtyard, which let in moonlight and cold drafts and memories of lightning. Other groups of boys had their mattresses together in clumps, two here and there around the room. No one wanted to sleep alone. They laid their mattresses like spokes on a wheel so their heads could be together. They'd each carried a candle when they'd gone together to the old sleeping quarters to claim their beds, and when they lay down, they put the 3 candles together on the floor in the space between them. Their faces were smooth in the candlelight, their hair dark with cold blackness all around. Walter lay on his stomach, watching the candle flames. Colin was on his elbows, quietly folding more paper animals. Jonathan opened the book the librarian had given him. The pages were yellow and fragile, and they whispered in the quiet of the room when he turned them. What book is that? Walter asked. Jonathan turned back to the cover. Robinson Crusoe, Jonathan read, by Daniel Defoe. I've heard of that, Colin said. Is it any good? Walter asked. Jonathan shrugged. I haven't started it yet. Could you? I was going to. No, man. I mean, like, out loud. Oh, yeah, I guess if you want. He licked his lip and cleared his throat and paged back to the first line. I was born in the year of 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, who settled first at Hull. Jonathan began. Reading was hard in the dim, flickering light. He followed the words he read with a fingertip. York, like New York? Walter asked. No, I think it means York in England, Colin explained. Oh, Jonathan continued. He got a good estate by merchandise, and leaving off his trade, lived afterward at York, from whence he had married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country, and from whom I was called Robinson Crutzner. I don't get it, Walter complained. It's an old book, Jonathan said. It's written all kinds of old fashioned. Nothing important has happened yet, though, I don't think. Oh, okay. And stopped interrupting. Okay. So he's reading the book. If it sounds different. But by the usual corruption of words in England, we are now called, nay, we call ourselves and write our name Crusoe. And so my companions always called me. What is that? A voice asked over Jonathan's shoulder. He craned his neck to see Miguel standing in the shadows, the candlelight playing on his curious face. Just a book, Robinson Crusoe. You going to read that whole thing? I don't know. I'm going to start at least. Huh. Miguel stood in the darkness and hugged his shivering body. Do you want to listen? Jonathan asked. No, Miguel answered quickly. But whatever. I'll go grab my mattress. A moment later, Miguel appeared with another boy, both dragging their mattresses behind them. Walter and Jonathan and Colin spread theirs apart to make room. I'll start over, Jonathan said when everyone was settled. He got a good estate by merchandise, and leaving off his trade, lived afterward at York, from whence he had married my mother. Can I listen too? Tony asked. Stood just outside the circle of light, a pillow under his arm. And me? Another voice asked. Jonathan looked up and saw David standing there. Sure. The boys already there made room in the circle for two more. Soon there were 7 heads facing one another through the flames. I'll start over, Jonathan said again with a sigh, and he did. With 6 pairs of ears listening to his whispered words, they all listened together to the story of a man trapped on an island far away from his family. The story held them together like the light from their candles, warm and close against the dark stone and shadows. But out in the darkness that surrounded them, there was the scurrying of rats, and above them he knew Sebastian slept with a sharp sword in the admiral's bed, and below them a hungry menace knocked at an ancient door. And even then, surrounded by friendly faces, his dark fears whispered at him, and the flickering warmth of their candles' light seemed terribly small and fragile. The flickering warmth of their candles' light seemed terribly small and fragile. But better than nothing, I think. Okay. Next chapter is chapter 14. Crimes must be punished. And at the end of the 13 is this letter home. Jonathan's second letter home. Dear Mother and Father. Dear Mother and Father, I am still here at Slabenge, of course. The food has gotten even better. I hope that you are doing better. Give my love to Sophia. Jonathan. Chapter 14. Crimes must be punished. I don't like the sound of that. The mail drop went off without a hitch the next day. Crusty old Cyrus was there instead of Patrick, and he didn't even bother talking to Mr. Vander. Mr. Vander, in quotes. The bags were traded without a word, and the boat motored off into the waves and fog and was gone. The rest of the boys, who had been hiding safely around the corner, came out to peer through the arch of the disappearing boat. It looked so small and the distance so great. A gust of wind blew a mist of salty spray into their faces. One more day, Sebastian said with satisfaction. At least one more day. He held the admiral's sword casually in one hand, its blade resting against one of his cheeks. Hand out the mail, Benny, he said before spinning and heading back across the courtyard. Benny pulled the rumpled envelopes out of the mailbag one by one and called out the names written on them. Jonathan jumped when his own name was called. Grisby, got one for you here, Johnny. Jonathan bit his lip and stepped forward to claim his letter. Benny held it out and Jonathan grabbed it, but Benny didn't let it go right away. Jonathan looked up at him and tugged a little harder, and Benny narrowed his eyes and smirked. I wonder what Mommy and Daddy have to say to you, Johnny, he said in a quiet voice. Nothing too nice, I bet, huh? And what you did? After what you did? Jonathan's heart clenched like a kicked puppy, and he felt the red creep of shame rising on his face. Benny showed his wet teeth and let go. He blinked a bored, slow blink and called the next name. Jonathan walked across the courtyard and inside. He lay down on his mattress, still with the others in the corner of the dining room, and ripped open the envelope. One folded piece of paper was inside. Jonathan swallowed, then pulled it open and read the words written in his mother's familiar, neat cursive writing. Let me see. Can you see? Let's see. Here it is. This is Mother's letter. Dear Jonathan, your father and I hope this letter finds you well. You were taken away just moments ago, and we sat right down to write it. We will mail it tomorrow and hope that you will receive it soon. So this must be his first letter, huh? The house feels so terribly empty now. We don't know what to say to you. So much needs to be said, we know. But we don't know what it is yet. We miss you. We've missed you for a long time now. We will write you every day. Miss Beth is so emotional. Jonathan, we will write you every day, Jonathan, and hope that maybe we can find what it is that needs to be said. We go every day with the flowers like you asked. Maybe having you gone for a while will help all of us. With love, your mother and father. P.S. They let you write. If they let you write, please do. Jonathan chewed his tongue thoughtfully and read the letter again. He whispered a line aloud. The house feels so terribly empty now. He licked his lips, then reread the last line. Maybe having you gone for a while will help all of us. He blinked his eyes hard and sniffed. A door slamming open behind him made him jump. He rubbed at his eyes quickly and stuffed the letters under his pillow. Sebastian stormed into the dining room, dragging another boy by his collar. It was a little kid named James, whom Jonathan didn't know well, but he knew he was one of the boys to whom Sebastian had given one of the grown-ups' rooms. Everybody gather around, Sebastian hollered. Benny and Gerald were just walking in from the courtyard. Sebastian pointed at them with the sword. Get everyone in here, he commanded. Jonathan jumped up and joined the nervous crowd, assembling around Sebastian and a terrified-looking James. They kept a few safe paces back. I want you all to see this, Sebastian said, glowering around at the group. I just caught James here, sneaking into my room. It's not really your room, Colin murmured. Shut up, Colin. Sebastian's eyes flashed cold fire at Colin, standing beside Jonathan. I caught him in my room, going through my stuff. I'm sorry, Sebastian. I didn't think, James whined, but Sebastian cut him off. Shut up, James. I caught him red-handed, eating my chocolate. It's not really your chocolate. Damn it, Colin, you better shut your mouth. Jonathan nudged Colin sharply with his elbow. Drop it, Colin, he hissed out of the corner of his mouth. Colin sighed angrily. Sebastian scanned the crowd, looking for defiance. All his eyes dropped to the floor when Sebastian met them, except Jonathan's. What are you going to do? Jonathan asked. Sebastian's dark eyes flickered with uncertainty. He chewed his lower lip and looked doubtfully at James, still trembling in his grip. Benny slipped forward in the hanging silence and hissed something into Jonathan's ears. That Benny. Sebastian's brow furrowed and he whispered something back. Benny leaned even closer and put a hand on Sebastian's arm, whispering fiercely into his ear again. Sebastian nodded after a moment and raised his chin to the group. He pointed the sword at Gregory and Roger. Bring in the sinner's sorrow, he commanded. A murmur ran through the crowd. The two boys exchanged a glance, then ducked out into the courtyard where the sinner's sorrow had sat since the final fateful morning muster. No, Sebastian, Colin said. Yes, Colin, Sebastian spat. Even with us in charge, crimes must be punished. You don't have the right, Sebastian's face contorted in fury. I have the sword, Colin. What are you going to do about it? Colin looked desperately to Jonathan. Do something, he pleaded. Sebastian looked expectantly at Jonathan, but Jonathan was looking at Benny. Benny's mouth was set in a small, grim smile, and he shook his head at Jonathan just one time. Jonathan, Colin begged. Jonathan eyed Benny for one more moment, then dropped his eyes to the floor and shook his head. Gregory and Roger grunted in, tugging the dreaded sinner's sorrow between them. They dragged more than carried it, and then they managed to pull it close enough to Sebastian that leaned against it, gasping. They leaned against it, gasping. The raindrops dripping down the dark wood looked like blood in the cloud-darkened light seeping through the window. Sebastian shoved James roughly toward the dripping sinner's sorrow. How many pieces did you eat? James gulped and looked out at the other boys again. All the eyes dropped. Like one or two, Sebastian, but one or two. Sebastian reached in his pocket and pulled a handful of shiny gold wrappers. One by one, he let them drop to the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4. He cocked an eyebrow and raised the sword to point it at James. 1 minute per piece for stealing, and 1 minute for lying to me. 8 minutes on the sorrow. Tears pooled in James's eyes. His bottom lip began to quiver. The watch, Benny, Sebastian said, holding out his hand. Benny handed over a tarnished silver pocket watch. Sebastian looked out again at the gathered boys. Who wants a room? One just became available. It's got a window and everything, doesn't it, James? James sniffled and nodded miserably. Okay, who wants it? There was a tense moment of silence. Finally, the kid named Reggie raised his hand. I'll take it. Sebastian smiled like a snake and tossed Reggie the watch. Keep him on there for 8 minutes, Reggie. I'm getting lunch. Make sure he doesn't cheat and make sure he stays on the whole time. If he gets up, the clock starts over again. Then the room's yours. Reggie nodded and stepped hesitantly forward. Get on there, James, Sebastian said, lowering his sword and turning toward the kitchen. Wait, Colin's voice stopped Sebastian cold. This isn't right. We never voted on this. The muscles in Sebastian's jaw rippled and he took 2 steps towards Colin. Mind your own business, Colin. Sebastian's eyes flickered over to Jonathan, then quickly back to Colin. This is fair. He stole from me. You said there were no rules. Well, Colin, I guess there's at least one. Don't mess with me. He gave Colin a long, steady glare. Next time you talk back to me, you get the sorrow, too. Sebastian stalked over toward the kitchen. The rest of the boys stood for a moment, awkwardly watching James kneel down reluctantly on the awful device. I'll start the clock, Reggie said quietly. When James whimpered and sniffled, Benny heard a couple of kids laugh. They spun other chairs around and settled in to watch James wriggle and moan. Jonathan swallowed down a sour sickness and turned away. Most of the other boys did too. A few wandered outside or into the kitchen, their eyes held carefully away from James's torment. Colin stood beside Jonathan, pale and frowning. This isn't right, he repeated. Just leave it alone, Jonathan whispered. It's not a big deal. If you stop pissing him off, you'll be fine. Colin looked back over his shoulder at James, shaking on the sinner's sorrow, and the 3 vultures watching him from their chairs. I don't think so, Jonathan. I don't think so. I don't think so either. How about you? Yeah, I shouldn't smile. It's really, really awful. When I first read this book, I think sometimes this is a little much. But anyway, it's a story. What do you think about this guy, Sebastian? Pretty creepy guy. Pretty bad guy. Poor James. And what do we think about Jonathan? Okay. Sinner's sorrow. Okay. Well, I'm not going to read 15 right now, but I will read it soon. The next chapter. Let's see, 15. I guess I could read 15. Yeah, why not? I'll read 15. Read 3 chapters. What about it? Chapter 15, A Drowned Dungeon. Jonathan shuffled through the pitch-black corridors, his eyes on the uneven floor before him, and his ears listening for the skittering sound of rat claws on stone. He held a tall white candle in one hand. He gripped the candle tight, his palms sweaty. His body didn't like being that close to the hot flicker of a flame. Neither did his heart, for that matter. He steadied his shaking as best he could and pressed on through the darkness. He ducked under the now familiar rope gate and descended the stairs, pausing for only a second to listen at the narrow passage that dropped down to the hatch. Then he climbed the other staircase and retraced his steps to the closed door of the library. Again light showed from beneath it, and again low humming sounded behind it. He took a breath and then knocked on the door. The humming stopped and the door creaked open. "Ah," the librarian said with a raise of his bushy eyebrows. "It's you again. Come in." Jonathan entered the lighted warmth of the library and let the door close behind him. "Back for another book?" No, just to look, I guess."
"Are you reading Robinson Crusoe?"
"Yeah, a bunch of us are. It's pretty good."
"Yes, it is."
The librarian turned and walked back among the shelves. Jonathan followed, the candle still in his hand. He stepped quickly away when he saw the giant rat, 99, atop a shelf at his shoulder, sniffing and stretching toward him with his nose. The librarian saw and smiled.
"Oh, don't mind him. He just wants to be petted."
The librarian reached back an arm, and the cat scrambled up it, his claws catching the woolen sleeve and curled up around the librarian's neck. I should get my rat out. I have a rat. He's up with the Halloween stuff. My rat. Anyway. What is the hatch? Jonathan asked abruptly. The hatch. The sound of its violent knocking and sloshing. How deeply it lurked in the darkness of the prison like a shameful secret, with the skull standing silent guard, had haunted his thoughts since he'd left it. The hatch. Ah, yes. Quite a curiosity, isn't it? Yeah, it looks old, and it makes all these weird sounds. The librarian smiled a strange, knowing smile and shook his head.
"It's old, but it does not make any sounds, no. It's what behind it that makes the noise."
"Well, what's behind it, then?" The librarian pursed his lips and leaned forward, cocking one eye sideways at Jonathan. 99's beady eyes sparkled at him.
"The sea, my boy, the sea itself, behind that ancient door."
"The sea? How?" The librarian heaved a heavy breath and walked over to the closest window, mostly blocked by standing books. He pulled one of the books down and peered through the space where it had been. The gray light shone through the old man's wispy white hair. "The water," the librarian whispered, looking out of the storm-tossed waves. "It is rising." He cocked one eye back over his shoulder toward Jonathan.
"Or the island is sinking. Both, I think."
He looked out again through the gap at the sea, where when he spoke this time his voice was different, faster, smoother, less labored. "Years ago, back in the asylum days, the water was not so high. There was a beach around Slab Hedge then, a smooth stretch of sand, with shells and logs and pools. We had a pier even, big enough for large boats to dock at. I would sit on the pier sometimes and fish, watch the sunset or rise, look off at the distant mainland and wonder. Of course, I was a boy then, so long ago." Jonathan stepped to stand beside him. He stood on his toes to see the white-capped ocean. "You were here when you were a kid?" The old man's eyes were trained far off in the distance. It means they were looking trained when they were trained in the distance. His voice was feathery and far away. "Oh, yes. I was born here. My mother and father were both patients here. She was a mad woman, he a lunatic. The asylum was my home, my school, my playground. The guards were my aunts and uncles, my friends, my tormentors sometimes." He brought one wrinkled hand to stroke the rat perched on his shoulder. The gigantic animal twisted and stretched so the old man's fingers could scratch his itchy places. "They offered to send me away to the high school on the mainland when I was old enough. The head warden, I mean. He was a kind enough man, I suppose, but I refused. It all seemed too terrifying, leaving the island, the walls, the water, so I stayed." The librarian sighed. It was a weary sigh, tired and breathy, and covered in the dust of years.
I became the librarian's assistant. I did my learning from these books and my traveling, my living, really, right here in these pages. When the old man died, the warden let me take his place. Not long after that, my mother died and my father, and I just stayed. When the asylum closed, they allowed me to stay to care for the facility, run the lighthouse, keep it all from falling apart. And when it reopened as a school, the admiral kept me on. So you never left the island? You've always been here? The librarian was still turned away toward the sea, but Jonathan could tell from the old man's voice when he answered that he was smiling. Oh, yes, always. I've never once left this island. This beautiful crumbling island? Not once. And I never will. Never. Jonathan took a breath and a step back. The rat turned on the librarian's shoulders and narrowed his eyes at Jonathan's pointy front teeth. And the hatch? Yes, the beach, foot by foot, year by year, went away, swallowed. Then in a storm, the pier was washed away. Behind the hatch is a staircase that leads down to the very bottom floor, the cellar, if you will. During the asylum days, it was a sort of special prison for the most troublesome. He returned the book to the shelf and half turned to look up at Jonathan in his queer way. A dungeon, you would probably call it. My father was there briefly, during these dark days. Eventually, as the water rose, it was too wet for people. There was standing water at high tide. It was a storeroom, then, high shelves. Then the water got too high even for that. It filled the room, began to climb the stairs. During one bad storm that maybe, 20 years ago, there was a surge, and it came all the way up into the main floor. So many rats died that night. He scratched his yellow fingernails through 99's fur and nuzzled the rat's neck with his face. So they installed the hatch. That's an iron door, solid through, 9 inches thick, bolted into the stone with foot-long bolts, sealed with cement and mortar and soldered steel, strong enough, they say, to hold the sea back. And those sounds you hear, that is the sea crashing and surging beneath it, sucking at forgotten windows, opening and closing submerged doors, tossing old furniture around, rattling old chains, chewing at the foundations, and always, always knocking at the door. He closed his eyes and sighed and stroked his monstrous rat. The sea is in the dungeon, seething beneath us. But it doesn't want to stay there. The old man's eyes opened and focused on Jonathan's. The old man's eyes opened. It wants the whole island. It wants it all. And someday it will get it. Jonathan's mouth was dry. He blinked. His mouth was stuck open. Now, the librarian said, taking a step and brushing past him, what book would you like? I'm still reading the first one, Jonathan said, shaking his head. I don't need another one yet. The librarian stooped down, and 99 crawled down his arm and onto a shelf. The old man looked back at Jonathan and shook his head and smiled a crooked smile. No, you can't leave the library without a book. He scanned the nearest shelf with a finger and one sideways eye. Jonathan stood where he was and watched the hunched old man creak along the shelf, muttering to himself and shaking his head. Ah, yes, this one is appropriate. I get a book. Becoming by Michelle Obama. This wouldn't be the book you would get. You can't leave a library without a book. Ah, yes, this is the one. He pulled a thick book. Another island story about a boy and a crazy sea captain and a treasure found. He held the book to his nose and closed his eyes and took a deep breath and handed it to Jonathan. Treasure Island. The cover said in plain black letters on red leather by Robert Louis Stevenson. These are some good books. Robinson Crusoe and now Treasure Island. Thanks. I better get back. Yes, the librarian said, walking with Jonathan to the door. You should. Thank the Admiral for letting you come. It's been so long. Jonathan stepped out onto the dark corridor, holding the candle before him. The librarian closed the door nearly all the way so that only his mouth and one eye were visible to crack. And say hello to the ocean for me when you go past the hatch. The door closed, leaving Jonathan with his feeble flame and the sound of rats, and in the darkness ahead of him, a rattling door to a watery dungeon. 3 chapters tonight. That's a record. So that was the end of A Drowned Dungeon. So that bottom part was the sea and the drowned dungeon. And before that, we read Crimes Must Be Punished and The Secret. The Secret? A Drowned Dungeon. 3 chapters. Crimes Must Be Punished. The Secret. Crimes Must Be Punished and A Drowned Dungeon. So finally, Jonathan has revealed to Colin something happened and his arms are all scarred. Scar Island, that's interesting. That is kind of a double entendre, they might say, a double meaning to the Scar Island, as these people have scars. So some things happen to them and it's hurt them. Oh, let's get emotional again, Miss Beth. Any opportunity, just bring it on. So the next one we'll read, and not right this minute. I'm going to make a different entry of it because the other class is going to be reading this. This is the first one that they will be. The other class, the Sycamore Room, has read this book, and the chapter they're waiting to have read by me, and you'll read it at the same time if you catch up. It's going to be Sorrow's Sinner, chapter 16. And there are 30 chapters in this book, so we're just a bit over halfway, just in case you're interested. You can see we're just about a little over halfway. A Sorrow's Sinner, chapter 16, Sorrow's Sinner, all S's. All right, we'll stop it, and we'll have 16 in a few minutes. Ciao for now.